Thank you very much for those kind words. What was the fee we agreed? Right. My name is Tom Henry, and I won't add anything to what you've been told before. I've been coming here now for many, many years. And one of the things that struck me about coming here is that as Catholics, so many people don't know about it. So many Catholics do not really know much about the Martyrs. And that's one of the reasons I'm here tonight, to talk to you about the Martyrs and also about the founders of this place. When you go out tonight, if you go home and you say nothing, I have failed. When you go home tonight, I hope you go home feeling and knowing what is so special about this place. Okay? Right. What I would like to do is to start off with a prayer. The prayer we will start off with is the prayer of the Mass for the English Martyrs on May the 4th. Let's just now place ourselves in the presence of God, who said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them." Almighty God, who in our country raised up martyrs from every walk of life to vindicate the authority of your Church in teaching and worship, grant through their intercession, we pray, that all our people may be gathered once again to celebrate the same sacraments under the one Shepherd, Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay. I'd like to begin by a statement that I've prepared. And I think it will encapsulate what we're going to do tonight. London is a city that attracts the admiration of the world, as is witnessed by the many millions that come to visit it every year. They will all admire the royal dominance of the Tower of London. They will stand in awe at the architectural majesty of Westminster Abbey. They will all enjoy the glorious splendour of St. Paul's Cathedral. However, there is a more sinister side to the city, of which most of those millions will be ignorant. For London, like a person, has skeletons in its cupboard, shameful acts, scandals, secrets best kept covered, hidden in the darkest corner of history, and never to see the light of day. Such would have been the fate of the little medieval village of Tyburn, if not for the deaths of 105 men and women who suffered a terrible death there. These were Catholics, men and women, prelates, priests, and lay people, who lived at a time when to be a Catholic was synonymous with being a traitor. All these people were condemned to a terrible death for having committed high treason against the monarch of the time. Yet none of these people incited rebellion or planned a revolution or the overthrow of the monarch. These 105 were in later years to be known as the English Tyburn Martyrs. The first of them was St. John Houghton, the prior of Charterhouse Monastery, who, when he refused to sign the oath of supremacy, was taken to the gallows with 4 others on May the 4th, 1535, to be hung, drawn and quartered, a punishment exclusively reserved for those guilty of high treason. The last of the martyrs of this period was St. Oliver Plunkett, Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland, who on July the 1st, 1681, a victim of the Oath of Allegiance and the Titus Oates plot, was taken wearing his episcopal vestments to Tyburn and suffered the same punishment as St. John Houghton almost 150 years earlier. In those intervening 1.5 centuries, more than 100 others suffered the same torment. The village of Tyburn was situated just outside the city boundaries, northwest of London. During 6 centuries, tens of thousands of people made their way out of Tyburn village and never returned. It was at Tyburn that they met their death, because Tyburn was the main place of execution for London. The names of nearly all these unfortunates are unknown. Such was the infamy associated with Tyburn that as London expanded and more wealthy people moved there, they wanted the notoriety of the place to be scrubbed away from history. Unlike medieval maps of London, you'll find no mention of Tyburn in more recent maps of London. Oxford Street and Bayswater Road used to be known as Tyburn Road. Park Lane, with all its opulent hotels, was known as Tyburn Lane. Adjoining areas such as Mayfair and Marylebone have kept their names and presence, but there is no Tyburn. In a strange twist of fate, and bringing a certain glory to the Tyburn story, the only people to die at Tyburn and to be honoured are the 105 English Catholic martyrs. So much so that there is now a shrine remembering their deaths and the sacrifices that they made. People will now come from all over the world to pay their respects to these martyrs. For these people, there is no shame attached to Tyburn. On the contrary, it is a place that commands their total respect. The shrine itself is housed in a convent close to where the gallows stood. The convent belongs to the congregation of the adorers of the Sacred Heart of Jesus of Montmartre, Order of St. Benedict, more universally known as the Tyburn Nuns. In defiance of history and its attempts to suppress the name of Tyburn, with each foundation of a new monastery, the name of Tyburn comes to a new part of the world. So from South America to Australasia to Europe, the name of Tyburn has spread throughout the world, thereby not only keeping the name of Tyburn alive, but spreading the story that goes with it. Okay. Now, you will come to Tyburn here today, and I tend to move around a lot. It's always harder to hit a moving target. But don't worry about that. Hopefully I'll be able to keep you all fully up to date with what's happening. Tyburn, let's start at the beginning. How did Tyburn begin? We've got this whole country here. Why Tyburn? Why did they have Tyburn here? Why did it become a place of execution? Well, Tyburn was a small little village, Ty and Bourne. Ty was the Saxon word for a little town. Bourne was the name of a river that flowed beside it, Tyburn. And not only that, you've got around here you've got Eastbourne, you've got Westbourne. All of these are related to the Bourne River. Anybody here from St. Marylebone, or Marylebone as they now call it? Anybody? Don't be frightened, don't own up. Okay, well, you take the area of Marylebone. Marylebone, by the River Bourne, there was a church called St. Mary's. Now, if you actually start repeating that, St. Mary by the Bourne, 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 St. Marylebone, St. Marylebone, you can see how the language moved forward. And that's how Marylebone got its name, because there was a church called St. Mary by the Bourne. It's a pity there's nobody here from Marylebone now, isn't there? They would have learned something, right? So that is what how the name developed. Secondly, why was it a place of execution? They could have chosen any place in the country. Why this place? Well, record of the first execution at Tyburn is back towards the end of the 12th century. But it's the first record. So as a historian, you think, well, if this is the first record, there must have been others before it. And in that degree, there was at Tyburn something that was very rarely found elsewhere. There was a clump of elm trees. Now, at that time, it was just 150 years after the Norman conquest. The Norman culture was fully sort of ensconced in England. The English ways, the Norman ways. And in the Norman culture, the elm tree had a special significance. It was a symbol of justice. So that's the reason why Tyburn became the place it was. Now, when people came to Tyburn, they were initially hanged on the elm trees. But then as time progressed, things developed. Kings got a bit nervous, and they thought of what was the best way to deter people from offending me, from attacking me. And so they devised this punishment, which we call hung, drawn and quartered. If you look at the old sentencing, that the words they used, people were drawn, then they were hung, then they were quartered. It has now changed into a different way. Hung, drawn and quartered. Before it was drawn, hung and quartered. You were drawn to the place of execution. Then you were hung till you were half dead. Then you were cut down and quartered. And then what would happen when they quartered you, the parts of your body would just spread throughout wherever the place was. And your head, in London, your head was normally placed, it was boiled in pitch and then stuck on a pole on London Bridge as a warning to others coming into the city. Because if you wanted to come into the city, you had to come by London Bridge. And it was boiled in tar because they wanted to stop the birds from getting to it and keep it all there. So they boiled it in tar and it kept it like that. But that was the sort of way the hung, drawn and quartering sentencing came out. I'm going to drop these now, aren't I? I'm not genuflecting, I'm picking up my cards. Now, as regards to the martyrs, there are two things that were essential for anybody to be considered a martyr. One, in terms of the Reformation, they had to openly profess their Catholic faith. And the second one is, and this surprises a lot of people, they had to accept the monarch as their rightful monarch. There are instances we have where people died for their faith, but they refused to accept the monarch as their rightful king or queen. They were never considered for canonization. Those two are very important. And often, when the martyrs, before they came to England, there's a picture there. There's a picture like that in the English College at Rome. And before the priests came to England, they would kneel before that picture and pray. And they'd make a vow, a certain vow. And that vow was that they would never take any political action against the monarch. And that's why people like, if you have some of that, the gunpowder plot, they were all Catholics, they all presented in a Catholic exterior, they all wanted to promote their faith, but they were automatically excluded from any sort of canonization process because they would not accept the monarch as their monarch. That is a very important thing because a lot of people don't realize that they had to accept, they may not accept the monarch as head of the Church of England, but they had to accept him as their rightful monarch. Now, part of the big problem we have with the martyrs, so anything else, is the gathering of information. I mean, in those times, they didn't have anything like codes or internet or scrolls or whatever. A lot of the information that you would need for a martyr was never recorded. Most of the martyrs lived very hidden lives. They were hidden. And when people live hidden lives, it's very hard to keep a track of what they're doing. And the second thing is, they all had aliases. So you're never quite sure of who you were talking about, or if a person could have two names, or three names even. So that made recording what the martyrs did very, very difficult. Now, we're very lucky because the priests had connections with the seminaries. They would write to the seminaries, and they received messages from the seminaries, and therefore there was a record kept of what they were up to, what they were doing, and what was happening. But for the ordinary layperson, there was no such thing. And so when we have martyrs being executed, we had records of who these people were. But as hundreds of did, if they died in prison, there was no record. If they died in prison, they'd be turned into a pit and buried, and nobody would know who they were. Nobody would know. So it's been very difficult to actually put together information that would stand up to a sort of canonical process of canonization. However, right from the very beginning, in the time of, I think it was Gregory XIII was Pope, and the martyrs were beginning to happen, shall we say, he immediately realized something very great was happening here. And even though he never started any process, he allowed their relics to be put on the altars during the liturgy. He allowed their paintings or their pictures of them to be put on the walls. But there was no official recognition of them as martyrs. And it gradually went down through history. One of his successors, Urban VIII, he took another stage further, and he was very much encouraged by the English Benedictines, who had quite a number of martyrs at that time. And then there was another guy called Richard Smith. In 1628, he presented details, and they were quite compact, they were quite detailed, and he presented them to Rome for canonization, or as part of the canonical process. But nothing much really happened. And then you had another Jesuit, Christopher Green. He put together more details. But the big breakthrough came with somebody you may have heard of, the Venerable Richard Challoner. He was a bishop at the time. And what he did was he put together this book, and he sent it off to Rome, and it has all the details of all the martyrs from 1577 to 1684. And it's very difficult to read because you need the binoculars to read the writing. But it's full of all the information that was needed to sort of become part of the canonization process. But the first cause came in 1874. About 361 were put together for canonization. Many of them never got very far, and some went all the way. Now, it's quite a complicated process to actually follow each stage of the process. But let me just give you a summary. Okay? In 1986, there were 41 beatified and 29 declared venerable. In 1895, there were 9 created beatified. 1929 was a good year for saints. We had 107 beatified. 1935, we had 2, and these were Thomas More and John Fisher. It's important to say here that Thomas More and John Fisher are not are not included in the English martyrs. They're not part of the 40. They're separate. In 1970, we had the 40 canonized English martyrs. And in 1987, even after they were canonized, we had 85 beatified. More. So altogether, we've got about 313 beatified and canonized martyrs. I bet nobody thought of that. That is how many martyrs and saints we have in this country at the Reformation. And sadly enough, all but 4 of them are men. There's only 4 women. But there was other group, and these were called the praetermissi, which means that they were looked over. People got it to them, but they were looked over, and nothing ever happened. And I've got here pages and pages of these praetermissi that were mentioned, but nobody bothered looking at them. And in this, you will find a lot of women. A lot of women. So women, you know what to do with a few moments. There's lots of women in here who are waiting to be canonized, who are waiting for their story to get out there. Because they need you. So, but do that. Now, England at the time was very, very, how do I put it? Always in a state of flux. Things were changing all the time, and especially with religion. If you take something like Henry VIII, Henry VIII, God bless him, he was confused. He didn't know which way to turn. In 1520, he produced this wonderful treatise condemning Luther and defending the sacraments. 15 years later, he pronounces himself head of the church. And not only in terms of religion, he saw himself as a Catholic. He believed in transubstantiation. He really did. And he actually prosecuted Protestants. And we had this strange thing that happened at Smithfield in 1540, where 6 people were executed. 3 were burnt at the stake, and 3 were hung, drawn, and quartered. The 3 burnt at the stake were known as Zwinglians. They were a part of the Protestant religion. He considered them to be heretics, so he burnt them. The 3 who were hung, drawn, and quartered were Catholics who would not accept his oath of supremacy. That's how confusing the situation was. It's a great example of people saying, which way did we go? Which way did we go? But this is the sort of guy he was. He was very sort of dictatorial, as we all know. But when he died, his daughter took over, a lady called, his son took over, Edward VI. Now, his son was a dyed-in-the-wool Protestant. And his son was only 9 when he came to the throne, but he had 2 bad uncles, so to speak. The Duke of Northumberland and the Duke of Somerset, both die-hard Protestants, who steered him down the road of Protestantism. And he took the whole thing another stage further, because during the time of Henry VIII, we had the dissolution of the monasteries. But Henry VIII was very clever. All he took was the valuables. He kept them for himself and for his friends. Edward VI went a stage further. He scrubbed out all the murals. He took away the altars and put tables there. And we now see during his reign the beginnings of Puritanism, or the Puritan faith. He died, and then we had Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII. She was a Catholic. So you can see what's happening here. We wake up in the morning and say, what religion is it? What's the state religion today? We don't really know. She was a Catholic. Perhaps she was very well liked initially. Her two big problems were she married the King of Spain, which wasn't the most politically best thing to do. She married the King of Spain. And she also prosecuted a lot of Protestants. And a lot of them were burnt at the stake. But she actually introduced the churches here, and during that time, a cardinal called Reginald Pole came over, and he steered the country now towards being accepted by Rome, and they were all going to be one at the same time. But she only reigned for 5 years. And then after that came Queen Elizabeth I. Back we go again. Everybody turn around, go the other way. And she was, as we know, Protestant. In fact, religion for her was nothing. She was worse than for or against. She was indifferent. And strangely enough, one of the strangest things about her reign was that they found it very hard to give her a coronation. Because the Archbishop of Canterbury, a chap called Reginald Pole, I just mentioned, he died within a couple of hours of Queen Mary. So there was no Archbishop of Canterbury to carry out the coronation, to do the consecration of her. So it was a terrible dilemma for her. And anyway, they had about 16 bishops, Catholic bishops, real properly Catholic bishops. And they ran all of them. Yeah, will you do it? No. Will you do it? No. Will you do it? No. And they got down to number 13. And he was the Bishop of Carlisle, a chap called Owen Oglethorpe. And he said he would do it on one condition. It was a Catholic ceremony. So it went ahead. And strangely enough, during the ceremony, Queen Elizabeth actually vows to protect the Catholic Church. It's part of the coronation ceremony. But of course, it meant absolutely nothing to her. And shortly after she was crowned, all the bishops ended up in prison. And it's one of the strange anomalies of the Reformation, because during the time of Henry VIII, it was only John Fisher who opposed the king. During the time of Elizabeth, and this, not many people will realize this, of all the 16 bishops, only one supported the Queen. All the others were put in prison or exiled. And in among that list of praetormici, there are 11 bishops who were Catholic bishops from the time of Queen Mary who died in prison. These were the times that they were living in. But one of the things I'll go through with Queen Elizabeth, the Tyburn tree. She was the one who invented it. In 1571, the Tyburn tree was created. And it was a move for mass production. Because on the Tyburn tree, you could execute and hang 24 people at the same time. And that's why it was built like that. Previously, it was just a cross pole, two stanchions and a cross pole. The cart was drawn under the pole, the noose was attached to the pole, the cart moved away, and then you hung there for about 10, 15 minutes. And that's one of her legacies to us now. That she was the one who started the Tyburn tree, in case you're wondering. Now, during her reign, we developed in this country a police state. There was no freedom of thinking. Everybody had to comply to the national religion. It was forbidden to leave the country. Those who had gone abroad, Catholics, had to come back. You were imprisoned without trial. The government spies were everywhere. England was a beleaguered country. From France, from Spain, from Scotland, she felt beleaguered, and therefore a very, very effective spy network grew up in the time of Queen Elizabeth. We think George Orwell invented Big Brother. It was way behind. It was way behind. Queen Elizabeth had been there before him, centuries before him. You couldn't really do anything. And even you got to the fact where children were taken from their parents so that their parents would actually conform to the new religion. It's quite unbelievable what you discover in the time of Queen Elizabeth. And there was entrapment as well. You take the case of Mary, Queen of Scots. False letters were being sent to her to entice her to say things that they could use against her. And in 1885, you had what we call the Babington plot, when this chap called Henry Babington was accused of plotting against the Queen. A lot of the evidence that they produced against him was false evidence written to discredit him and the people who were with him. So this was all happening in the time of Queen Elizabeth, and it's not something we actually think about. The other thing is, people were encouraged to spy on their neighbour. And this happened to one particular Saint Anne Line. Anne Line kept a safe house for priests. And it was the Feast of the Purification. And people were realising, there's a lot of people going to that house. So they informed the authorities. They raided the house, found the priest, took her away, and she was hanged at Tyburn in 1601. This was the state that the Catholics were living in. They were living in a totalitarian state. It was very difficult for them to do anything at all. Okay, how am I doing for time?
You're good. You can move on to the next one.
Pardon?
You can move on to your next.
I've gone over my time, have I?
No.
Okay, don't forget those. I want to get through so much here. There were, all the time they were coming up with new laws. One of the biggest was 1585. It was the Act Against Jesuits and Seminary Priests and such like disobedient persons. And this was used so many times against the priests and against the laity. And it was responsible for the death of at least 150 priests and their helpers. They quoted this law. You couldn't say Mass. You couldn't reconcile people to the faith. You couldn't carry out the sacraments. It was really designed to curb that type of thing. And Catholics faced crippling fines, astronomical fines that they couldn't pay, and unless these fines were paid, they went into prison and they stayed there. And unless you had money, you didn't get out of the prison unless you paid the bill. Prisons in those days were a bit like terrible hotels, shall I say. You paid for everything. If you wanted a room with a view, you paid for it. If you wanted food, you paid for it. If you wanted a thick straw mattress, you paid for it. If you wanted the change to be taken off you, you paid for it. And then you paid again for those change to be put back on. It was a terrible... Nobody would want to go to jail. But unless they paid the fines, that's what happened to them. And Loads of people died in jail. Loads of people died in jail. And we don't know who they were. Okay. Is that up? All right. Okay. I'm going to do something completely different because I'm determined to get through, if not everything, some of everything. Okay? Hopefully I'm giving you some sort of idea of what it was like to be living in England in the time of the Reformation. It was not a nice place to be if you're a Catholic. But let's move on now to something a bit more positive. But the lady who actually came here and is responsible for all this. Her name was Maria del Garnier, and she was born on the Feast of the Assumption, 1838. She was born in the small village of Grancy-le-Château in Burgundy. Now, most of you have never heard of Grancy-le-Château. I hadn't till I went there. But the title gives it away. Grancy-le-Château, there's a magnificent castle there, magnificent castle, built in the 13th century. But it has other claims to fame. St. Bernard of Clairvaux went there. He had two brothers besieging that castle, and he went to sort of entice them away, but they stayed where they were, and St. Bernard decided he'd go off and be a Cistercian. Also in the area was Francis de Chantal. Jeanne de Chantal, she was there as well. And not far away, you have Paray-le-Monial, which was the origin of the devotion to the Sacred Heart. That gives you a flavour of what was there. Now, Maria del Garnier, her father was an architect, and her mother was her mother, had no real profession, but she was extremely weak. Was unable to spend a time with her children. She only spent a few hours every day with them because it was just too much for her. Anyway, after 3 years, they moved to a village nearby called Is-sur-Tille. And at the age of 6, unfortunately, Maria del Garnier, her mother, died. Now, one of the characteristics, one of the constants in Maria del Garnier's life is the element of suffering. She suffered a lot. And she suffered so much and was so willing and cheerful in her suffering that she's often referred to, like many of the martyrs here, the last Tyburn martyr. That's what we tend to refer her as, the last Tyburn martyr. But her first suffering came when her mother died. But if you look at her life, nothing happens by coincidence. There's always things happening that move into place. And it was her grandmother who took over, her maternal grandmother. And she writes later on and says her grandmother was a very pious woman, and she was the person she loved the most. She spent some time at Is-sur-Tille, but then they moved onwards, and after that she made her way to Dijon. And one of the things that her mother asked her husband to do, whose name was Nicolas Garnier, she asked, please, please, please make sure the girls make their first Holy Communion. That is what she really wanted. She wanted her children to make their first Holy Communion. She was a very pious woman. Now, her husband had a great reverence and respect for the faith of his wife. So he set about having the girls educated, and he sent them to a convent at a place called Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, which is about southeast of Paris. And they went to the convent there, and she stayed there till she was about 12. Well, She was educated there. She came back and was divorced to Dijon, where her father was. But she eventually finished there at the age of 12. She came back to Dijon and she was educated there at home. Now, several years later, she was betrothed to a young man, and it was not a marriage that she was looking forward to. And she found her way out of it, to be quite honest. Very clever. She was coming down the stairs one day, and don't forget, Maria, she was very pious at the time, but she was quite very holy, and she heard her fiancé boasting to his friends that when they got married, he would make sure that he would curb her religious practices. And she heard this, and she immediately shouted out to him, "I will not marry you. I am not going to marry you." And in an act of French melodrama, he picked up a scissors and stabbed himself in the chest. He survived, and she didn't change her mind. Right? But when she looks at her time of life here, she says that when she made her first Holy Communion, she was very enthusiastic. What she remembers most about her first Holy Communion day was that she prayed that her father would be converted. That's what she remembers, and she puts it in her memoirs. And so she was very enthusiastic. But like a lot of enthusiasm, when she got home and with the family and everything, that enthusiasm drained a little. And she recalls it at the time as being a bit frivolous, a bit scatty, drifting really in life. And it wasn't until 1875, it was Lent, and she went to this church in Dijon, and there was this preacher there, and he gave this most magnificent sermon about the love of God. And she was really struck by this, so much so that afterwards she went round to the presbytery and asked to speak to the priest, and she wanted him to become her spiritual director, which he did. And when she spoke to him, he did something really extraordinary, something we don't perhaps appreciate now. He said to her, "I want you to go to communion every day." Now that was a real blast, because it wasn't encouraged. It was only when Pius X years later gave the universal decree that people can go to communion every day. But her spiritual director said, "Go to communion every day." And so she did. And it brought her to another sort of level of existence. She was trying to develop this devotion, and she started this devotion to the Sacred Heart. But she suddenly realized that I need something else. I need something else. So she asked her father if she could become a governess. And he said he agreed to it. And so she became a governess. And she went to be a governess at a family in Nantes. And she was called the Crochards. They were a very good family, very religious family. But it's interesting what happened, what she had to say. And I'll just read it out to you, because it gives you the sort of person she was. Here we are. Wait for it. It's worth waiting for. Now, this is what the children wrote about her. One of the children said, "A young girl of 23, not pretty, but most attractive, tall, slender, graceful, with charming manners, a very sympathetic exterior, joined to a pleasant, even character." Now, her response to this was totally different. This is what she writes in her memoirs about going to this family. Initially unimpressed with the de Crochars, a family which I did not like, agreed to have me as governess. Fear and sadness seized me, and I experienced what seemed to be an unconquerable repugnance. In spite of all the kindness shown to me and the confidence placed in me, I experienced an extreme aversion for this milieu, for this life of retirement in the country. And here comes the punchline. This is what she writes in her memories. But Jesus was waiting there for me. Now, as for the family, they loved her. It was a complete attraction of opposites. They really did love her. And she spent a few happy years there, developing her skills as a governess and also her spirituality. So much so that she entertained the idea of a religious life, of having a vocation. And she went to a convent in a place called Conflans. It was called the Convent of the Sacred Heart. And when she was there, she only lasted 2 months. It had such a strange effect on her. She was so weak. She left absolutely she was feeble. She couldn't move. It was almost like the same disease that her mother had. And it's the first time it had struck her in this way. She had to leave. She went back to Dijon, to her family, her sisters and her father. And it took her a couple of years to recover, till she got her strength back. And she started thinking again about what she was going to do. Now, the de Crochars at Nantes had an aunt, or the children had an aunt living in a place called Laval. And when this aunt in Laval heard that Marie de Garnier was available, they offered her a position with them. Now, if she thought Nantes was bad where she was, well, she went to a place called Aulne, very remote. The nearest town, Laval, was about 20 kilometers away. The church was 4 kilometers away, and she struggled to get to it. Really did struggle to get to it. But she persevered. And one of the things she did was to pass it up. She became a catechist. She decided she would teach catechism to the children. And she did this both at Nantes and at Aulne. She taught them. And at Nantes, when she was doing it, one of her pupils was a chap called Charles Sauvé. He was to become one of her spiritual directors later on and help her in establishing a congregation. She was very devoted to these children, and she tells a lovely story when she was at Aulne about this boy, he was about 15 years old. I'm afraid he was a bit slow, a bit backward, and he couldn't make his first Holy Communion unless he could pass the catechism test. The boy couldn't read or write. And she spent a lot of time trying to teach him and get him to remember orally the catechism. And eventually, he passed the test. And we're told that, remember, you can't get communion every day. We're told that after a few more communions, he died. And she always remembers that, about when she was teaching catechism to the youngsters there. After that, one night in 1874, this is where she really begins to move forward. She's sitting in her room, and suddenly there's this bright light, this tremendous light. And in the middle of this light, she can see a host. It's all in what she writes in her memoirs. And in the host, there was this picture of Jesus pointing to a Sacred Heart. It was something that she remembered for years and years and years. And the first thing she did that night was she spent the night in prayer. The second thing she did was when she found a congregation, each one of them wears a medal with that engraving on it, the image of the Sacred Heart. But we move on a bit more, and things are always moving a bit pacey now in her life. One day in 1874, she's sitting in the sister room, and somebody reads out about this wonderful basilica that they are going to build in Paris. Wonderful. And she actually says, it made her feel so weak. She almost fainted when she heard it. And she says herself, deep down, there was this voice that said to her, I need you to be there. Now, the basilica at Montmartre, I don't have any been to the basilica at Montmartre? Yeah. Good. Right. That basilica was the result of what was known as the national vow of France. And to understand the national vow, you have to go back to the times of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, 1689. She gets a message from the Sacred Heart to say, I want the King of France to consecrate himself and his courtiers to me. And I want the Sacred Heart to be emblazoned on the royal standard. And I want a building to be made in my honour. Nothing happened. The French did nothing. Nothing's changed. They did nothing. They did absolutely nothing. We now go forward to the French Revolution. Okay, it's 1793, and Louis XVI is in prison, and he writes a letter. It's his last will and testament, and he says, "If I'm freed, I will put into effect what the Sacred Heart has asked for." It didn't work because the next day he went to the guillotine. So nothing ever happened. Now, the year 1870 comes along. Now, it's a very, very important year in France because it was the year the Prussians invaded France and they swept across France. There was no opposition at all. France was on its knees. It was also the end of the Second Republic in France. And because of the Prussian invasion, everything was in chaos and became quite lawless. And it gave rise to what became known as the Paris Communes. Now, people began to remember these things, what the Sacred Heart said. And at one battle, the Battle of Wagny, they went into battle with the Sacred Heart emblazed on the standard. For the first time, it was there. And this encouraged a lot of people and gave them hope. And a guy called Alexandre Gentil, he became very much caught up in it. And he was at Poitiers, he lived at Poitiers, and he started this movement which ended up in the national vow. Now, one should say that when this was all going on, this was 1870, also the year of the First Vatican Council and the issue of papal infallibility. It was also the year when Italy became united. Garibaldi was sweeping it all. And in 1870, he entered Rome, took the Vatican, and imprisoned the Pope. But the Pope because he was the Pope, was allowed to do his spiritual duties, and he then went on with the First Vatican Council. But what also happened, and so many things are happening now. This Monsieur Le Gentil, he was waiting for something to happen. Nothing was happening. So one night he went along to it was the 11th of the 11th of January, 1871, he went along to his priest and he got down on his knees and he read the prayer for the national vow. And it went, in view of the misfortunes which devastate France and even greater evils which perchance threaten her, in view of the sacrilegious outrages committed at Rome against the rights of the Church and the Holy See, and against the sacred person of the Vicar of Jesus Christ, we humble ourselves before God, and embracing in our love both church and country, we confess that we have sinned and have been justly chastised. And in order to make reparation for our sins and to obtain the infinite mercy of the Sacred Heart of our Lord, the pardon for our offences, as well as to obtain the succour necessary for the deliverance of the Sovereign Pontiff from his imprisonment and the cessation of the misfortunes of France, we promise to contribute towards the erection of a sanctuary dedicated to the most Sacred Heart of Jesus. This was the French national vow. And it was first prayed on the 11th of January 1871. Now, 6 days later, people see this as a response to this prayer for the national vow. There's a little village on the Brittany-Normandy border called Pontmain. And on the 17th of January, when all that was going on, the wars are going on and everything, Our Lady appeared in this little village. Now, Pontmain was a very poor village, very poor. It had, a few years before, suffered the ravages of cholera and typhoid. It was really a place of no hope, which really reflected what was going through France at the moment anyway. And it was there that our Blessed Lady came and she said to them, listen, keep praying, my son is turning towards you, listen. And that night, the Prussians stopped. They withdrew back. And 2 weeks later, there was a peace treaty signed between Prussia and France. And so hostilities ceased. But, and this is where we come to a very important point, when Marie del Garnier heard about this vision, she rushed to Pontmain. And she spoke to the children, because only the children could see this vision. And she asked them to describe the vision to her, which they did. Now, Maria del Garnier was a really gifted artist. Her father was an architect, and she'd often help him with the drawings. So she was a gifted architect, okay? And she then painted a picture of Our Lady of Pontmain. And it was this that she actually drew. This is a statue of Our Lady of Pontmain. This is what Maria del Garnier drew. This is the official image from the church of Our Lady of Pontmain. Now, you'll notice one or two things here. She's got a black veil. The children describe this woman as having a black veil. Normally, with statues of Our Lady, you see a white veil. Perhaps a blue one, like the one over there has got a white veil. But this one had a black veil. And secondly, if you look at the decorations on her robe, blue background, golden stars. When Pontmain was on its knees, a priest came along, called Père Guérin, and one of the things he did was to do up the church. And when he painted the ceiling, that's what he painted. Blue sky, golden stars. And that's how she appeared when she came to visit the village of Pontmain. How are we doing?
We need
Okay, right. I'm going to just quickly, there is so much here, but I just want to give you a flavour of what's happening. And I want to give you one of the most astonishing stories of this whole thing. And this will really make you believe why this place is so special. Out there is special because out there is the tomb of Mother Maria del Garnier. It's special because at Tyburn, the Reformation started with St. John Houghton, and the Reformation finished with Oliver Plunkett. So, and it's special now because when the nuns were in France, they moved to Paris. She actually got to Montmartre, and she was there to see it being built, but she never saw the completed building. There happened to become, in 1901, what they call the laws of association. And these were directed against religious communities. And it meant that this congregation, that she's only started in 3 years, she started in, the official date was 1898. So it's only going for 3 years. And the laws came out to say, if you don't do what we tell you, you've got to go. But she came to England, and when she came to England, they had a place in Notting Hill. And let me just see if I've got this here. She was a very practical woman, and she was a great Anglophile. And she loved it. She loved England, and she loved the English ways. And when she came to England, because she loved the English ways, she wanted to do as people do in England. And in her diary, she had this great belief that English drank beer. That's what it was. They drank beer. All of us. All of us, believe it or not. And in her diary, on the 26th of October, she writes, 4.5 gallons of beer, 4 shillings and threepence. That's my kind of saint, really. But it shows one aspect to her, though. She was a woman who had her eyes, ears, heart, her whole being on Jesus Christ and heaven. But her feet were firmly on the ground. And I'm now going to tell you the marvelous events that took place that enables you to be here tonight. When they first came to England, they took a place in Notting Hill, number 4, Bassett Road. Well, you know it, do you? Is it your house? Sorry? You used to be people there? Yeah, oh, I see, right, Bassett Road. It's a small world, really. Did they still get beer? Anyway, she lived there, and they took some rooms there. There were about, at this time, 11 of them. And all the time, things were happening. Things were happening. As they drank their beer behind the doors at number 4 Bassett Road, things were happening in the world around them. And at that time in England, there was a small group of people who were really intent on having a shrine for the martyrs somewhere. And this included Cardinal Vaughan, John Bede Cam, the Duke of Norfolk, and this other guy called Dudley Baxter, who worked at the British Museum. Now, Dudley Baxter every day would pass by Marble Arch, and he'd always say a prayer there for the martyrs. And on this particular day, he was saying his prayers, and he looked up, and then he saw house for sale. So he was immediately galvanized, and he wrote to all his compatriots and said, listen, there's this house for sale. This would be the ideal opportunity for us to get a shrine at Tyburn. So Also happening was the priest in Kilburn, Quex Road, whom they knew from France, called Père Lemius. He was helping the nuns, and he was writing to the Archbishop saying, these nuns need a place to live. Now you can see what's going to happen. On that same day, at the same post, in came the letter from Dudley Baxter. In came the letter from the priest asking for a place for the nuns. And it all sounded really too good to be true. In fact, it was. Because when they looked at the place, it just wasn't right for their convent. But the idea of the martyrs at Tyburn really they were really taken up by that, particularly Mother del Garnier, because she always saw herself as a martyr. She suffered a lot. And Paris, they'd been at the Montmartre, the Mountain of the Martyrs. Here at Tyburn, the place where the English martyrs met their death, this was just so good that she wanted it to happen. But she was told there were 3 problems. First of all is the properties are very expensive and you've got no money. And secondly, if people find out that you're going to put a convent here, there's going to be a lot of opposition. And it was very difficult for them because they needed to raise the money, but they couldn't tell people what the money was for because there'd be this great opposition. So they did the only things that nuns could do in that situation. They prayed. Okay? And they prayed, and then one day in the afternoon, she had a visitor, a friend who'd been in Paris, seen in Paris a few times. And that this person did something that she'd never done before. She explained to her that she had received this inheritance, 15 years before, and she'd never done anything with it. And she said, I want you to use it for the Sacred Heart. So she gave them the money. And later on the evening, she got a letter from her solicitor saying, we've got you a house. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. But that's not the end of it. If you actually look outside Tyburn, there's this green plaque, and on it is a quotation from a priest, a chap called Gregory Gunn. Now, Gregory Gunn was a priest during the time of the Reformation. He was known as a Marian priest. In other words, he was ordained during the time of Queen Mary. And they were given a little bit of latitude, as long as they didn't make too much of a disturbance. The authorities didn't pay too much attention to them. Okay, and he actually was caught one day praising Campion, Edmund Campion. And he was hauled before the courts, before the Privy Council, and they asked him to explain himself. And if I can read this properly, they said to him, how can you praise Campion? And Gunn replied that Campion, even though as an errant, a traitor as he was a good man. They answered, then Gunn answered, say not so, for the day will come, and I hope to see it, and so may you, that there shall be an offering where Campion did suffer. And the other chap said, what shall we offer on the gallows? And Gunn said, no, not so, but you shall see a religious house. Built here for an offering. That was 300 years before this place was created. amazing, an amazing statistic, fact. But that's what it is. This is why this place is so special. This is why it's so special. It was special in the Reformation, and it's special today. Now, I want to share with you a little quirk. A little quirk that suddenly struck me when I was sort of doing a lot of research. When the nuns bought this place, several years down the line, they were in great financial troubles. And just as there was great joy at buying Tyburn, there was also a great fear and sadness that they were going to lose it. And so some people came up with different schemes, like sponsor a nun, or things like of that ilk. You laugh. It was true. It was true. Sponsor a nun. But there was a bishop, and his name passes me by, and he was wise. This was an astute guy. He says, well, if you want money, you've got to go to the rich people. So he went to he said to people, we want you to donate 100 guineas to save Tyburn. And all those who donated 100 guineas will become known as the founders of Tyburn. Now, when you go up and down those stairs, you'll see all these brass plaques on the wall with names on it. Those were the founders of Tyburn. And they all offered 100 guineas. And the strange thing is, when they offered that money, there was about 1908, 1909, there were only 30-odd Tyburn martyrs recognised. Now, if you actually look at that 100 guineas, come forward to today and look at that 100 guineas, and you actually then converted it into modern currency, because in the past there it was pennies, farthings, sixpences, half crowns, and you transferred those 100 guineas to what it would be today. It would be £105. It's the same number as the English martyrs. Anyway, I shall leave you with that. Hopefully you found it useful, and I'm sorry we couldn't get through it all. I'm sorry we couldn't get through it all. But hopefully, when we come to the next round, you'll all come back again for a further session. Thank you.